I woke up in Tucson, Arizona, to another funeral. Gave a woman 14 days to leave the house I built with my own two hands, and I said one word back to her. Understood. 3 weeks later, a federal agent knocked on her door with a folder under his arm, and everything she'd stolen came apart in a single afternoon. My name is Robert Halloran. I'm 71 years old, and before I tell you what happened in that house on Mesquite Ridge Road, you need to understand how a man spends 43 years building a life, only to watch a stranger try to erase it in a single week. None of what happened to me was an accident, and none of what happened to her was luck. If you believe family should mean something, and that the people who betray it should answer for it, stick with me to the end. And if this story moves you the way it moved me to live it, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one and this family's fight for justice coming. I bought the house on Mesquite Ridge back in 1983. I was 26 years old then, driving a delivery truck for a produce distributor 6 days a week, and my wife Carol was 8 months pregnant with our daughter, Emily. We didn't have a dime to spare. I remember standing in that empty living room with Carol, no furniture yet, just sunlight coming through bare windows, and her telling me it was the most beautiful room she'd ever stood in. We didn't have money, but we had that house, and to two kids from nothing, it felt like we'd won something nobody could ever take back. Carol picked the color for every wall herself. I laid the flagstone patio out back over 2 brutal Arizona summers, mixing concrete by hand because we couldn't afford to rent the equipment. We raised Emily in that house. We watched her ride a bike down that driveway for the first time, watched her leave for college in Flagstaff, watched her come home 4 years later with a nursing degree and a fire in her that made Carol so proud she cried at the graduation photos for a week straight. Carol passed away 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late, gone in 11 months. After that, it was just me in that house, rattling around 4 bedrooms that used to be full of noise. Emily worried about me being alone out there, and I understood why. So when she told me she wanted to move back in with her husband, a man named Craig Dunmore, to help take care of me in my later years, I told her yes before she even finished the sentence. I thought it was love. I told myself my daughter had found a good man, and that this was simply what family did for each other. I had no idea that Craig's wife, the man my daughter had married 3 years earlier, had already decided that helping an old man was never the point. The point was the house. Looking back now, I can see the first signs appeared within the first month. A grieving old man doesn't always want to see what's in front of him, and I wanted so badly to believe my daughter had built something solid. I gave Craig a key to the front door myself. I never once imagined that key would end up being used against me. Craig Dunmore was 36 years old when he married Emily. Polished, easy smile, always the first one to shake your hand at church potlucks and ask how your knee was healing. But behind the front door, in the day-to-day of that house, he was somebody else entirely. Within the first 4 months of moving in, he had already boxed up Carol's ceramics from the dining room hutch without asking, telling Emily the space needed to breathe. And he'd converted the small den where Carol used to do her needlepoint into what he called his trading office, full of monitors and cables I didn't understand and didn't ask about. I let it go every time. It was easier than fighting over a room in my own house. Emily worked long shifts at the hospital, 12 hours on her feet, and every night she came home exhausted, caught between a husband who wanted things his way and a father who just wanted peace. I watched my daughter get quieter every month that passed. She used to call me twice a week just to talk about nothing. By the end, most weeks, I'd get one short text. I never said a word against Craig to her face, not once, because I could see she was carrying enough already. But I noticed things. I noticed how he talked about our property taxes, like his name was already on the deed. I noticed how he asked me, more than once, in that easy, joking voice of his, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things and putting the house in a trust with Emily and him as the trustees. I noticed how he watched me come down the stairs sometimes, like he was clocking how many more years those stairs and I had left in us together. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man with too much time on his hands. I told myself my daughter was happy, and that had to be enough. I was wrong to stay silent as long as I did, but I loved my daughter more than I trusted my own gut. And at the time, that felt like the only right choice available to me. About 5 months before everything changed, Emily came to me alone on a Sunday afternoon, while Craig was out at what he called a networking breakfast. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where she used to do long division with a pencil gripped too tight in her fist. and she had a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 16 and had wrecked her first car. She slid a thick brown envelope across the table and told me to hide it somewhere Craig would never think to look. I asked her what it was. She said, "Dad, please, just trust me on this. If anything ever happens to me, you open this before you do anything else, before you talk to anybody, before you sign anything." I laughed a little, told her she was being dramatic, that nothing was going to happen to a healthy 34-year-old woman with her whole career ahead of her. She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with an expression that made the hair stand up on my arms, something between fear and a decision already made. I took the envelope without opening it and locked it inside the old Army surplus lockbox I kept in my closet, the same box where Carol used to keep our marriage license and Emily's birth certificate. I didn't press her for more that day, because my daughter looked like a woman who had already thought this through from every angle, and I trusted her completely. Now, looking back, I wonder how long she had already known. I wonder how many nights she lay awake next to that man, quietly building a case to protect her father, without ever saying the words out loud to me. That envelope sat untouched in my closet for 5 months, and I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything. It was a Thursday night in March when I got the call that split my life into before and after. Emily had been driving home from a night shift on Speedway Boulevard when a driver ran the light at Craycroft and hit her car broadside, on her side, going almost 50. The paramedics told me later she never regained consciousness. I remember standing in my own kitchen with the phone against my ear, unable to make a sound come out of my throat. Craig was in the next room when the hospital called back a second time with the final word, and I remember hearing him go quiet, then hearing something crash to the floor, like he'd knocked over a lamp reaching for a chair. For one moment, one brief moment, standing in that hallway together, I saw what looked like real devastation on his face, and it made the whole night feel slightly less like drowning alone. The days after are mostly fog to me now. Calls to the funeral home, choosing a casket that felt too small for the size of the loss, calling Carol's sister in Sacramento, calling Emily's coworkers, half of whom I'd never met. Craig handled the arrangements, the flowers, the obituary, and at the time I was grateful, because I could barely remember to eat. I kept listening for her car in the driveway at 7 a.m., when her shift usually ended. I kept catching myself setting out 3 coffee mugs before I remembered there were only 2 of us left in that house. Losing Carol had nearly broken me. Losing my only child felt like losing the last living proof that Carol and I had ever built anything at all. I sat in Emily's old bedroom one night, still decorated the way she'd left it at 17, band posters curling at the corners, and I cried until there was nothing left in me to cry with. I had no idea that in less than 10 days, the man standing beside me at her funeral would turn to me in that same house and tell me my time there was finished. The service was held on a bright, cold Saturday morning at St. Augustine's, the same parish where Emily had been baptized 34 years earlier. Close to 150 people came. Nurses she'd worked alongside for a decade, girls from her college dorm who flew in from 3 different states, neighbors who'd watched her grow up on that street. I stood at the front near the casket, shaking hands I could barely feel, accepting hugs from faces I recognized but couldn't place names to. Craig stood beside me through the entire service, dressed sharp in black, playing the part of the devastated husband with what I now understand was practiced precision. After the burial, everyone came back to the house for the reception, the same tradition we'd kept since Carol's funeral 5 years before. I was sitting in my armchair in the living room, still in my funeral suit, when Craig walked over holding 2 glasses of iced tea, handed neither of them to me. The room was full, maybe 30 or 40 people, standing in small clusters with paper plates, speaking in that hushed reception voice everyone uses when they don't know what else to say. He leaned down close to my ear and said, quiet but sharp enough that the people nearest us went still, "You need to start thinking about your next move, Robert. This house is going to be sold. You've got 14 days. The room didn't erupt, but it went completely silent in that particular way. A room goes silent when everyone heard the same terrible thing, and nobody wants to be first to react. I saw my neighbor of nearly 20 years, a man named Gary Okafor, freeze with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. I saw one of Emily's nursing colleagues, a woman named Denise, put her hand flat against her own chest like she'd been the one struck. Every person in that living room heard what Craig said. On the day we buried my only child, inside the house I had poured 43 years of my life into. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with him in front of the people who had come to grieve my daughter. I looked at him for a long moment, and something in me went completely quiet and still, the way desert air goes still right before a storm rolls in off the mountains. I thought about Emily, about the envelope locked in my closet, about the 5 months I'd spent trusting my daughter without asking a single question I didn't need to ask. I thought about 43 years in that house, about Carol's wall colors and the flagstone patio I'd built with my own 2 hands, one shovelful at a time. Then I looked Craig dead in the eye and said, "Understood." One word, nothing else. The room stayed frozen another few seconds before people slowly drifted back into their quiet conversations, unsure of exactly what they'd just watched happen to a man on the worst day of his life. I stood up from that armchair, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and packed one duffel bag. I didn't need much. 2 changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, a photograph of Carol and Emily from a 4th of July barbecue years back, and the lockbox from my closet with Emily's envelope still sealed inside it. I came back downstairs 15 minutes later, bag over one shoulder, box under my other arm, and walked straight past Craig toward the front door. He looked almost let down that I wasn't fighting him, like he'd been braced for tears, for begging, for something he could point to later and call an old man losing his mind with grief. I gave him nothing. I opened the door, stepped out into the cold March air, and walked 3 houses down the street without turning around once. Behind me, I could still hear the low, uneasy murmur of confused guests standing inside what used to be my home, wondering what exactly they'd just witnessed happened to Robert Halloran. Gary Okafor had lived 2 doors down from me for almost 20 years, ever since he and his wife Adaise moved out from Phoenix. He was 68 now, a retired high school shop teacher, the kind of man who still rebuilt his own truck engine in the driveway on weekends just because he liked the work. He'd been at the funeral that afternoon, and he'd heard every word Craig said in that living room. When he opened his front door and found me standing on his porch with a duffel bag on my shoulder and a metal lockbox under my arm, he didn't ask me a single question. He just stepped back and said, "Get in here, Robert. It's freezing." His wife Adaise had the guest room made up before I'd even finished my second cup of coffee at their kitchen table. Gary poured 2 mugs, slid one across to me, and sat down across from me without saying anything for a long minute. Then he finally asked, "You want to talk about it?" I told him everything. The 14-day deadline. The way Craig said it low and mean, right in front of people who'd come to mourn my daughter. The way his face had looked almost satisfied delivering it. Gary shook his head slow, jaw tight with a kind of anger he was holding back out of respect for the day. "That house is yours, Robert," he said. "Deed's been in your name since before Emily was born. That man's got no legal ground to put you out of anywhere, and you know it." I nodded, but honestly, my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of it yet. My mind was on that lockbox sitting beside my chair, the envelope inside it that Emily had told me to open first if anything ever happened to her. That night, after Gary and Adaise had gone to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under one small lamp, and I finally broke the seal. Inside were 4 things that changed the entire shape of what I understood to be true. The first was a certified copy of the deed to my own house, confirming exactly what Gary had already told me. The property had never once been transferred out of my name, not to Emily, not to Craig, not to anyone. The second was a life insurance policy Emily had taken out through the hospital system 3 years earlier, worth $425,000. 4 months before she died, Emily had quietly changed the beneficiary designation from Craig to me. The third was a manila folder of bank statements Emily had printed and highlighted herself, documenting nearly $90,000 moved out of their joint checking account over 18 months into an account Craig had opened under a business name I didn't recognize, something called Dunmore Capital Solutions, LLC. The fourth was a letter, handwritten in Emily's careful nursing school penmanship. In it, she explained that she'd discovered Craig wasn't working in consulting the way he claimed, but had been running some kind of unlicensed trading scheme with money he'd siphoned from their savings, losing most of it, and that she suspected he was planning to eventually push me out of the house so he could sell it and cover what he'd burned through. She wrote that she'd already met twice, with a divorce attorney in secret, that she was terrified of what would happen when the truth came out, and that she needed me to promise her one thing, that no matter what happened to her, I would fight for that house, because it was the only piece of Carol she had left to give me. I sat at that kitchen table and read that letter 3 times, tears running steady down my face. Not just grief now, but something sharper underneath it. a clarity settling hard into my chest. My daughter had seen this coming. My daughter had spent her final months quietly building a shield around her father while carrying that fear alone. I folded the letter back into the envelope, closed the lockbox, and for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like a helpless old man anymore. The next morning, while I was still at Gary's kitchen table eating toast I couldn't taste, Craig was already moving fast back at my house. A neighbor across the street, an older woman named Patricia Whitfield, who'd lived on Mesquite Ridge Road even longer than I had, called Gary's landline around 9 to say she'd seen a real estate agent's car and a for sale coming soon sign already staked into my front yard. The agent, a woman named Melissa Cordero, had listed comparable homes on the street within the hour on her company's website. Craig was moving to sell my house less than 18 hours after burying his wife and less than a full day after telling her father to get out. What Craig didn't know was that Emily's letter had told me exactly where to look and exactly who to call. That same morning, I phoned an old family friend, a man named Walter Ashworth, a real estate and probate attorney who'd been practicing in Tucson for almost 35 years. He'd handled our closing paperwork back in '83, and he'd known Emily since she was in diapers. I told him everything: the funeral, the 14-day deadline, the envelope, the sign already staked in my yard. Walter told me to sit tight, and within 2 hours, he called back with news that turned my stomach over. He'd pulled the Pima County Recorder's records that morning, and there it was, a quitclaim deed, filed only 4 days earlier, supposedly signed by me, transferring full ownership of the house from Robert Halloran to Craig Dunmore. The problem was the notary date on that document. According to the stamp, I had personally appeared before a notary and signed away my house on a day I could prove, with a receipt sitting in my own wallet, that I'd been 300 miles away in Sedona at Carol's sister's granddaughter's christening. Walter didn't waste a minute once he saw that document. He'd been practicing law long enough to recognize exactly what he was looking at: a forged deed, backdated, notarized under false pretenses to look clean on paper. He traced the notary commission number listed on the filing and found the notary herself, a woman named Brenda Castellano, had no record whatsoever of ever notarizing anything for Robert Halloran on that date or any other. Walter suspected, and later confirmed, that Craig had paid Brenda, a woman he'd known through his old trading circles, to forge my signature and stamp the document using a notary seal that had technically expired 8 months earlier, but that nobody at the county had caught yet. Walter explained to me plainly that this wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was deed fraud and forgery, both third-degree felonies under Arizona law, both carrying real prison time. He asked me one question before doing anything further. "Robert, do you want to handle this quiet? Keep it inside the family? Or do you want to report it and let this play out the way it's supposed to?" I thought about Emily, about her handwriting on that letter, about how hard my daughter had worked in her final months to protect a father she loved more than she ever let on. I thought about Craig standing in my living room the day we buried her, telling a grieving old man he had 2 weeks to disappear. I looked at Walter and said, "Report every bit of it." Walter filed a formal fraud complaint with the Pima County Recorder's office that same afternoon, attaching the forged deed, the notary's falsified record, and Emily's original letter as supporting documentation. By 4 o'clock, the case had already been referred to the Tucson Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The detective assigned was a man named Detective Marcus Webb, a 19-year veteran who'd built his whole career on property and elder fraud cases specifically, the kind of detective who took a case like mine personally. Walter met with him that same evening and walked him through the full timeline. Emily's death, the funeral, the 14-day eviction demand made in front of dozens of witnesses, and a forged deed filed while my daughter's body was still at the funeral home. Detective Webb pulled additional records that night, including my own credit card and bank statements from Sedona, confirming beyond any doubt that I'd been 300 miles away the day the deed claimed I'd personally appeared to sign it in Tucson. He also reached out to the real estate agent, Melissa Cordero, who had absolutely no idea the property she'd agreed to list carried a fraudulent ownership claim. Melissa, wanting nothing to do with a fraud investigation, immediately pulled the listing and the sign from my yard within the hour. Detective Webb told Walter that between the forged notary stamp, my provable travel records, and Emily's handwritten letter documenting Craig's financial deception, he had more than enough to move for a warrant. He also mentioned something that made my hands shake, reading Walter's text message that night. Craig had already attempted to file an early claim with Emily's life insurance carrier, listing himself as sole beneficiary, apparently unaware the policy had been legally changed to my name 4 months earlier. That attempted claim alone triggered the insurance company's internal fraud unit to open its own review before the police had even served a single warrant. Everything Craig had rushed to do in the 10 days after burying his wife was now collapsing in on him, one document at a time. Exactly the way Emily had quietly built the case to happen if he ever tried something like this. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Tuesday morning, a Tucson police cruiser and an unmarked sedan pulled into the driveway of my house on Mesquite Ridge Road at 8:15 a.m. Patricia, watching from her porch across the street, told Gary later that Craig answered the door, still in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, confused. Detective Webb identified himself and informed Craig he was investigating a formal complaint of deed fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud connected to the property, and that he had several questions regarding a notarized document filed with the county recorder's office 9 days earlier. According to Patricia, Craig's face went the color of drywall standing in that doorway. He tried to explain that I'd signed the paperwork before I moved out, some story about a rushed conversation in the driveway. Detective Webb calmly informed him that my bank and credit card records placed me in Sedona, 300 miles away, at the exact hour the notary stamp claimed I'd been standing in front of her in Tucson. Craig was brought in for formal questioning that same day, along with Brenda Castellano, the notary who'd forged the stamp. Within a week, both were formally charged. Craig with deed fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud. Brenda with forgery and notary misconduct, her commission revoked permanently by the Arizona Secretary of State's office. The forged deed was voided immediately once the county recorder confirmed the fraud, restoring full and clear ownership of the house back to my name, exactly where it had legally sat the entire time. Craig was given 7 days to vacate the property while the criminal case proceeded, the very same house he'd given me only 14 days to leave less than a month earlier. Gary told me later that when the moving truck finally pulled up for him, not one neighbor on the whole street came out to help him carry a single box. Patricia stood on her porch the entire morning with her arms crossed, making sure he didn't try to walk off with anything that wasn't his to take. I moved back into my house on Mesquite Ridge Road on a quiet Thursday afternoon in April, almost exactly 5 weeks after I'd walked out with one duffel bag and a metal lockbox under my arm. Gary and Adaise helped me carry my things back inside, and Patricia brought over a casserole dish that evening, still warm from her oven, the same kind of quiet, neighborly kindness that Street had always shown me, long before any of this happened, and long after. The house felt different without Emily in it, and it always will, but it also felt like mine again, completely, the way it was always supposed to feel. I found Carol's ceramics still boxed up in the garage, exactly where Craig had shoved them months earlier, and I unpacked every piece and set them back on the dining room hutch where they belonged. Craig eventually accepted a plea agreement on the fraud and forgery charges, avoiding trial and the maximum sentence. But the deal still required him to serve 18 months in state custody, pay full restitution on the insurance claim attempt, and carry a permanent felony record that will follow him the rest of his life. That last part mattered to me. It mattered that a judge looked at what he did to my daughter's memory and decided a quiet fine wasn't going to be enough. He never once tried to contact me after his sentencing, and I never reached out to him either. There was nothing left between us worth saying. Some evenings I still sit in that same armchair in the living room, the chair I was sitting in the day Craig leaned down and told a grieving father he had 14 days to disappear, and I think about my daughter. I think about how, even while she was quietly carrying her own fear month after month, Emily found a way to protect me one final time before she ever knew for certain she'd need to. That envelope in my closet wasn't just paperwork. It was my daughter's last act of love for her father, prepared and sealed away months before either of us understood how badly it would be needed. I lost my only child, and there is no version of any of this that gives her back to me. But I kept the house we built our family inside of, stone by stone, summer by summer. And more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who my daughter really was, right up until the very last thing she ever did for me. If this story moved you the way it still moves me telling it, do me a kindness and hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.